Uddipana ma'am, are you able to hear me clearly now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you.
Technology is always difficult, right? So
I just logged out and log in once again.
Okay.
Ma'am, I think we can start now.
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. A very good morning to one and all who have joined us virtually for this two-day international conference. REVA University heartily welcomes you all to this cerebral conglomeration. I, Professor Swati Reddy, research scholar and assistant professor from the School of Arts, Humanities and REVA University, deem it an honor in hosting today's session. To quote Carl Jung, as far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light of meaning in the darkness of mere meaning. Interaction and exchange of thoughts and ideas constitute the essence of knowledge. To read, to reflect, and to question are at the heart of knowledge. Let this convergence of intellect, creativity, and novelty lead to a fruitful discussion of ideas. It is indeed a proud privilege to be a part of this two-day international interdisciplinary conference on the topic Narratives, Self and Identity, Traditions and Innovations on 30th and 31st of August 2021, organized by the School of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, REVA University, in collaboration with ISPIL, Indian Society for the Promotion of English Language and Literature, and Liverpool John Moores University, England. I'm delighted to announce that the response to this two-day international conference has been overwhelming and more than 400 participants have registered across the globe. Thank you all for such an encouraging and an enthusiastic response. Once again, I heartily welcome all the participants of today's session. And it is indeed an honor to welcome and introduce the esteemed speaker for today's session, Dr. Uddipana Goswami. Dr. Uddipana Goswami is a writer and feminist peace researcher with a PhD in conflict studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. She is the author of 6 books, including an academic monograph titled Conflict and Reconciliation, The Politics of Ethnicity in Assam, and a collection of short stories set against the violent conflicts in Northeast India, titled No Ghosts in the City. Her book In Progress on Gender and Ethno-Nationalist Conflicts draws on her Fulbright postdoctoral research at the University of Pennsylvania. A former journalist and editor, Dr. Uddipana worked with several multinational and hyperlocal media groups from National Geographic Channel to Seven Sisters Post. As an academic, she has taught at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, India, Guwahati College, University of Pennsylvania, USA, Curtis Institute of Music, USA, and the Peabody Institute at the Johns Hopkins University, USA. I accord a hearty welcome to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Swati. Thank you for that introduction.
Dear participants, you can post your questions to the resource person in the Q&A box during and after the session. We will take up your questions once the resource person ends her talk. And now, without much further delay, I request the resource person, Dr. Uddipana Goswami ma'am, to kindly share her insights on the topic, Marginalized Women in the Gendered Conflicts of Indian Periphery. We really look forward to hearing from you, ma'am. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Swati. Hello, everybody, and I'm really happy to be here today and talking about a topic that is close to my heart. From Dr. Swati's introduction, you would have gathered that I'm a little scattered, like a little all over the place. But if there's one thing that's common to everything that I have done, whether it's journalism or academics or creative writing, it's to talk about conflict and peace and gender, right? And especially women's role in all of this, in peace building and in conflict. So today's talk will also be about women and gender. And actually, I should warn you that this is going to sound a little like a book talk because right now, that's all I am thinking about. I'm working on this book and this book on conflict, women in ethno-nationalist conflicts in Assam. And because I'm so much into it, that's all I can think about. And that's what I will be talking about. And because it aligned with the conference's theme, here you are, okay. So before we really understand the situation of women in ethno-nationalist conflicts in Northeast India, what we really need to understand is the gendered nature of the conflicts themselves. So we hear a lot about trafficking of women, about rape and other forms of sexual violations by security forces and by the non-state armed forces. You know, the two armed patriarchies that Paula Banerjee talks about. We hear about rising instances of domestic violence, and these are all different ways in which conflict has affected women disproportionately in the region. So if you study conflicts anywhere in the world, really, this is true everywhere. Women are the most vulnerable. And why is that? So that is what I wanted to look into. That is where I started working on this book that I'm currently working on. For those of you who don't know, I grew up in the Northeast. I grew up in Assam, and I am actually located in Assam right now. And so my concerns, my work with conflict, with women, with how they are dealing with their marginalized existence, all of these are not just abstract scholarly questions, right? These are these inquiries that I'm making are actually based on my lived experience in the conflict zone. During the peak conflict years, and also intermittently even after that, although these stories were more effectively suppressed, we heard a lot about sexual atrocities against women by the armed forces. But even when the armed forces are not involved, in the Northeast, especially in Assam, because that is the focus of my research, I find the data to be really alarming. Violence against women has been increasing steadily, and the statistics on domestic abuse, it's alarming. Okay, the National Crime Bureau records showed, the data showed, that was released in December 2020. It shows that Assam's rate of crimes against women is the highest in India, and that is something to think about. So in multiple articles and papers I have, and at various forums when I talk about on this topic, I have raised the question of this very distinct connection that exists between political and ethno-nationalist conflicts on the one hand and violence against women on the other. And this violence can be happening inside the house or outside in public spaces. And then there is the invisibility, the silence of these women. So why are there no women in the public forums of reconstruction and political reconciliation? Currently in the Northeast, we are in a post-insurgency situation mostly. So several memorandums of understanding, memorandums of settlement, ceasefire agreements. So several of these treaties, instruments, have peace instruments. Yeah, that's a misnomer. But anyway, several of these documents have been signed by both parties in conflict, right? Insurgent groups have laid down arms and they are talking peace with the government. There's a lot of conversation around rethinking nationalist agendas, about ethno-nationalist ideologies and the way forward and so on and so forth. But nowhere in this whole process, nowhere do I hear or see the women, not substantially. There are some token presences maybe, but you do not really hear or see the women. And why is that, right? So these are certain questions that I've been grappling with for a while, and that's where my work lies. But before I get into these questions, I just want to take a step back, and I want to look at the cultures, the structures, and the systems, really, that make such violence and such invisibility possible. So that forced me to think about power relations. It forced me to think about disempowerment. It forced me to think about those who are removed from power, right? And it's not just women. I'm talking about all marginalized entities. So really, my research into the women in Assam is a look into the conditions of marginality and the violences, the many different kinds of violences, whether it's political or interpersonal, that are taking place in these margins. In other words, what I examine is how a general climate, a general social climate of violence and impunity, right? Violence and impunity, and kind of aggressive machismo, how all of that generates this culture where violence against the marginalized, violence against the powerless is normalized, right? It's just a way of life, deal with it, right? And I really, I find these correlations between the marginalized constituencies, meaning I look at both gendered as well as geopolitical marginalities, and I look at how they negotiate their relationship with the centers of power. So over and above the women of the Northeast, the whole peripheral region, right, the entire Northeast itself also becomes a marginal entity that I explore. So I look at its conflictual relationship with mainland India, and that in turn, this exploration in turn, it raises so many questions that can be studied through a feminist perspective. And when I talk about a feminist perspective, I just want to pause here and talk a little bit about feminist peace research and what I do, right? So feminist peace research, at its very basic, it involves engendering conflicts. So what you do is you place women at the center of the inquiry. Yes, you know, it's always research, and most of the traditional scholarship is androcentric, especially the scholarship on conflict, and more specifically the scholarship in the Northeast and on Assam. It's very, very androcentric. But engendering also involves developing a gender-sensitive theory and practice. So undeniably, there is a bulk of literature on Northeast conflicts, right? And all of it, like I said, is androcentric. It is gender blind. So, but of course, on the other hand, we are developing a rich literature on the women in the conflict zone. Okay, there are various studies that analyze the role of women as victims, or even as you know, perpetrators, survivors. These you know, scholars like Paula Banerjee or Rita Manchanda, they did pioneering work on women in the conflict zone. And then there's There are other contemporary scholars like Sangamika Chaudhary, Dolly Kikon, to some extent myself. So we have been looking at women as survivors, as individuals with agency, and as victims. And there are also studies of women who participated in these violent activities, in the insurgency movements. So women as perpetrators as well, right? And their relationship with the armed movements and the armed patriarchies. But what, as I was going through this literature, which is becoming, very encouraging, which is becoming more and more prominent, and people are talking more and more about this. What I found is possibly missing is a feminist interpretation of the conflict situation, meaning not just studying the women themselves, right? Not just looking at women as a part of, as something apart from the rest of the narrative, but looking at women as a part of an entire constellation of marginalized entities and placing them within that inquiry. So that is what I do in my book. And it's a gap that I'm trying to fill with my work. And as Swati said, I started doing this work as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've been working on it since, actually even before I went there. And right now, like I said, I'm in the middle of it. I'm just getting it ready for publication, and hopefully this will be done soon and I can move on. So looking at women as one of the marginalized entities and exploring how these marginalized entities negotiate their positions in larger universes of power. That is what I'm talking about. So how do women negotiate their position in a patriarchal society, which is characterized by aggressive machismo, right? How do smaller ethnic groups engage with larger ethnic groups or larger autochthonous groups that control the political or religious or social power, right? And finally, how does the region itself, how does the periphery itself, the entire Northeast, how does it interact with the center of all power on the mainland, right? So the Indian state has marginalized the region and has equally, at the same time, tried to nationalize it. So how does the periphery interact with this kind of a power universe, authoritarian power universe? In fact, my entire inquiry begins by using this gendered lens to study the mainland periphery relationship. I look at the patriarchal processes of nation building in India. So these are the processes that constructed the feminine imaginary of the nation, right? The nation as a woman, as the mother, Bharat Mata, right? And it valorized kind of militant masculinity, which is aimed at protecting this female body. Okay, so this entire warlike, imaginary, and any threat to this national body, real or perceived, has to be met with violence. Right, we have to have our soldiers going to war. So when the many communities of the Northeast, when they resisted being included within this national body, and I'm talking about when the Indian nation was being formed, right? When they resisted being included in this national body, they were threatened with violence. Not just, and they weren't just empty threats. We all know the history of state-sponsored violence in the periphery, from let's say the aerial bombings of civilians in Mizoram, down to the secret killings in Assam, which happened not very long ago. So, this is what I'm talking about. This is, how I'm looking at the mainland-periphery relationship. And as this relationship was developing, some communities in the Northeast were, like I said, resisting being included in the Indian national imagination, and they were threatened with being crushed like dogs. And these are, real words that were used. There were others. There were those like the early leadership of of Assam, the political leadership of Assam, the Assamese leadership. They were keen, very keen to be included in the new Indian nation. And to that end, they were even willing to self-construct the region as the feminized other. So the reason that I keep moving between Assam and talking about the Northeast is because I'm sure many of you are already aware. Most of what is Northeast today used to be included in Assam, except for the princely states of Tripura, Manipur, and some other places. And it's only over the years that Assam has come to occupy the geographical space that it does now, right? So because of this historical fact, it's necessary that I move between using the Northeast and Assam interchangeably at times. So as I was saying, the Assamese leadership of Assam, they were willing to self-construct the entire region as the feminized other, right? So in their imagination, Assam became the Numolia Ji, or the youngest daughter of Mother India, because the British came to the Northeast 100 years after they came to India. And the whole process of assimilating the periphery with the mainland took a long time, and so they looked at themselves as late entrants, and they were willing to self-construct themselves as the youngest daughter of Mother India, and so on and so forth. Now, what really intrigues me in all of this is that this was a predominantly masculine leadership that we are talking about, right? And very patriarchal. And the fact that they should assume a feminized identity, to me, it indicated that the patriarchal structures in the region were perhaps a little more accommodating than those on the mainland. Of course, that has changed, but there is also this idea, and to some extent, it is not without some logic. It's also, to some extent, a misconception that the women of the Northeast are entirely free from patriarchal control in the early days. When you look relatively at the patriarchal structures on the mainland and in the periphery, yes, the women here, had more freedom, more mobility, and the patriarchal structures were not as rigid as they were on the mainland. But to say that the women were entirely free from patriarchal control in those early days, that's a little problematic. I do not subscribe to that view. But of course, like I said, if you look at it on a relational scale, the gender relations in the periphery were less dichotomous than they were on the mainland. Perhaps this is because there were these alternate models of masculinity and femininity that existed mainly among indigenous communities. And that could be one of the reasons, and I am exploring that in my work. But that's a digression. Without going too deep into that right now, I just want to point out that there was a very very discernible shift in the gender dynamics after the Northeast started being nationalized, right, and integrated into the idea of India, the national imagination, national imaginary of India. So what happens when disparate nationalities and subnationalities with varying levels and structures of patriarchal control? What happens when they collide? Hegemonic masculinity begins to take root. And this leads not only to a mutation of gender relationships, but also, as it happened in the case of the Northeast, it started changing the ethno-nationalist dynamics. So dichotomous relationships, they are characterized by hierarchies. They are characterized by hierarchies of sub and superordination, structural inequalities, unequal access to power, resources, and all of these begin to surface in the Northeast now, right, after its association with the Indian nation. And violent responses start to become legitimized. Such violence manifested itself in the Northeast through the intractable conflicts, through militarism and militarization, right? That came first, militarization. Now, I've written extensively on how militarization and the brutalization of the armed forces and laws like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, all of them have a very palpable relationship, a very clearly traceable relationship with the legitimization of hyper-masculinized violence and criminalization of society at large. And that is what is happening in Assam today, in the Northeast as a whole, okay? And in this environment, who is affected the most? It's the women. And so women studies scholars globally, they have already established that there is a distinct relationship between intractable conflicts of the kind that we have seen in the Northeast and the kinds of violence which they inform and instigate. So it can be sexual violence or political. It can be intimate violence, or it can be public violence, right? Domestic or public. And I merely expand on it to explore the connections between militarization, hypermasculinization, and gendered violence during ethno-nationalist conflicts. I also believe that we have seen such violences escalate because we are not reframing our approach to peace in the Northeast. So we talk about conflict, but very rarely do we talk about peace. And whenever we are talking about peace, we are really only looking at it as an absence of violence. What we are doing really is we are emphasizing on negative peace. And this is the kind of peace that is established by ceasefires, by treaties, political reconciliation and reorganization. It's not the kind of organic or positive peace that we talk about, peace that is a condition of life. So it becomes an exception to the condition of conflict that we are so habituated to. And that's what's happened. We have become so habituated to conflict systems, to conflict structures, which are all characterized by machismo and the power of money, the power of the gun. There are all these polarizing structures, violent structures, right? How do we go beyond that? And how do we look at alternate approaches to peace? So what I did was I followed the women into these marginalized spaces. Where are they? right? Okay, so they are targets of violence. Okay, so they are marginalized from the mainstream processes of political reconstruction. But are they entirely without agency? That was my question. So to be very honest, my research actually began from a place of anger. I was very angry that these women were just not there, and I felt they were not, asserting themselves, and they were not, using their agency. Why were they invisible? Why were they not there in the public sphere? And I spoke on multiple platforms about how these women had played very crucial roles in the ethno-nationalist movements. They both as members of civil society organizations, as insurgents themselves, and even as individual members of society. And this is when I started my research. My fieldwork, as I said earlier, was restricted to Assam. And what I found, that kind of took away all the anger. And I found that these women were, yes, they were living in these marginalized spaces, but in their marginalized existences, within those marginalized spaces, what they were doing was they were quietly, noiselessly, they were transforming the post-conflict reality. Or I don't know if we can say that we are in a post-conflict situation yet. I prefer to use the term post-insurgency. So what I found was that these women were there in these margins, and they were noiselessly working towards transforming conflicts. Now, a conflict transformation is, again, another idea that has not really taken root in the scholarship on conflict and peace in the Northeast. The idea here is to look at conflict as, not always a bad thing. It can be, it is necessary for human progress, right? For social progress. It can be a catalyst for social and structural changes. It can transform relationships. It can reconcile parties in conflict, and it can create a whole new reality. And this reality is more sustainable if it is based on peace and if it is not conflict habituated, like I was talking about a little while back. So when I started using this lens of conflict transformation to look at the ethno-nationalist conflicts in Assam, what I found was that the women of Assam were doing just that. They were, transforming the reality, the social reality. They were doing this in their marginalized spaces, and they were doing it away from all these public platforms of reconciliation, of reconstruction. And they were creating this new reality. They were making positive peace through very powerful but non-confrontational ways. And these non-confrontational ways were also at the same time redefining gender relationships. So, for instance, they were finding economic independence. They were achieving professional fulfillment. They were creating supportive communities, working as cooperatives. And in all of this, all that they were doing, they were really bringing about ethnic reconciliation, reconciling the different communities in conflict. And that is what I call organic peace, building it up from the bottom, right? And that is also sisterhood. That is also solidarity, right? That is what it's all about. And as a feminist peace researcher, I found that very satisfying. So currently, or recently, I was putting together this edited volume on finding peace in Assam and all the communities working together mutually. And when we approached, me and my co-editor, when we approached the different scholars who contributed, scholars and practitioners who contributed to the volume, they were not they were not consciously working with a feminist perspective in mind, but everybody without without an exception talked about making peace mutually, that all the communities in Assam have to come together, they have to work together in order to bring about sustainable peace. And that brings me back to this whole idea of solidarity, of sisterhood, right? And how this is a very feminist idea. This is a very feminist ideal, right? And it's an ideal that can be achieved. And to me, the future of peace in Assam is a feminist future. And as I tell my students when I'm teaching them how to live a feminist life, that's one of the courses that I offer. We really need to replace the desire for power over, right? That is how we look, generally tends to look at power, right? That is how power works in our in the current system and society that we are in. The desire for power over another, right? We need to replace this desire with the idea of power with. The moment we reframe our approach, the moment we think about power with instead of power over, we change our reality. And I very strongly believe that it is the marginalized people, the marginalized entities who have been, away from the centers of power for so long. It is they who can really appreciate this kind of power. This is the power of alignment, of allyhood, of allyship. It is the power of solidarity and the power of togetherness. And from my research, that's what I found, that the women of Assam are doing just that. And while I was thinking that they had withdrawn from the public platforms and oh my God, why did they do that? What they were really doing, what they were really practicing was something more powerful. And non-confrontation, that has been used as a very effective strategy of resistance throughout history. We all know, I don't need to go into that here. We all know that it has been used as a very effective strategy of resistance, and the women of Assam are using it towards building this, kind of peaceful coexistence for themselves. And that's where I see hope, and that's what I'm currently writing about. And having said that, I will stop speaking here and hear from you.
Swati, you can probably read out the questions.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for that thought-provoking session. You opened up new vistas of learning in the realm of Northeast studies in matters of gender conflicts and marginalization. Thank you, ma'am. We have a few questions, ma'am. So I will take up the questions. I will read it out for you. Ma'am, there is a question that goes like this. Does tradition or conservatism play any role in the hindrance to the progress of marginalized women?
Do you want me to take the questions one by one?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
As per your convenience, if you want, I'll read it out for you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for this question, tradition, conservatism versus progress. So what we really know as, sorry, just give me one second. What we know as tradition or conservatism, that is what I look at as systems, right? Systems of oppression. And of course, yes, they always act as hindrance to the progress of the marginalized, whether it's women, whether it's minority communities, anybody. And having said that, of course, there is the flip side, that tradition does not always have to be wrong. It does not always have to be on the wrong side of history or whatever. But I do believe that progress depends a lot on questioning what is given. So our traditions are given to us. I will not even address the conservatism. So our duty as progressive individuals, if we are really committed to working for marginalized communities, is to question what's given to us. And that is something that I very often tell my students. Learning, changing, progress, development, it begins with questioning the status quo. And the moment you accept the status quo, you've stopped exerting agency, you've stopped working towards progress. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, ma'am. There's another question, ma'am. Do you need to compromise with the hard reality, sacrificing truth at some level?
Okay, that's deep. I do not think I know the definition of truth, because I do not think there is one definition of truth. Truth is so subjective, isn't it? So whose truth are you really sacrificing? What are you compromising on or for? So I think we need to question our own questions sometimes and our own presumptions. When we think that we have arrived at the truth, we really need to question what that truth is, whether my truth is your truth, right? So I'm sorry, this is really not a question that I can give you a direct answer for, because like I said, there is no definitive definition of truth. And if I am sacrificing your truth for my truth, I'm doing you a disservice. On the other hand, if you are sacrificing, if it's the other way around, you're doing me a disservice, right? So we really need to create a society where we are accepting of each other's truths. I think that's the way to go forward. We accept, yes, but we also critically question, right? It's not about finger pointing, or it's not about finding faults, but it's about critically examining each other's truths and also accepting them at the same time.
Right, ma'am. Ma'am, there's another question. How would you look at emotional conflict in matters of gender? Do you think women struggle for the emotional space too in a patriarchal world?
That is a beautiful question. Thank you. Again, this is something that I talk with my students a lot. Emotions also are political. Yeah, it's all so intricately connected. So emotional, women do struggle, right? They do struggle to have their emotions validated, just as they struggle to have their experiences, their voices validated, right? It becomes a little disillusioning for my students when I say this, but our emotions are really not ours. They are conditioned. They are also conditioned by the circumstances around us. So yes, it's all very intricately connected with the outside world, the circumstances that we are in.
Thank you, ma'am. a few more questions to go, ma'am. How are children placed in the conflict of Northeast, and how is violence affecting them?
So yeah, that is an entire book in itself, right? Or more, really. And children, women, disproportionately affected, right? Childhood, childhoods are taken away from the children. So they lose agency more than, most other marginalized constituencies. There's trafficking, there's poverty, there's, sexual violence. It's unending, and they are definitely one of the other communities that are very disproportionately affected, right? So yeah, I don't have statistics for you right now, but I can definitely say that it's not a very rosy picture for children. They don't have education, and just recently, I was looking at pictures of children who had to travel miles to just find a connection, right, for their online classes. And that is the state of infrastructure, because that is the kind of infrastructure that the conflict zone has. And of course, that kind of problems are being faced by people everywhere in this COVID situation, in this, global pandemic. But if we were to look specifically at the children here, the people here, I think everything here is connected, intricately connected to our conflict history.
Thank you, ma'am. Do you think Assam too has become patriarchal, like most of India?
I wouldn't say Assam has become patriarchal. It was always patriarchal. It's just that women had maybe certain kinds of freedom, right? Which women in other parts of India may not have had, and that comes from our proximity and our, being coexistence with the many indigenous communities. And I have said that when I was speaking, that there were always these alternate models of masculinity and femininity prevalent here. So women, of course, had more mobility, they had more visibility, but did they have agency? Did they have control over their lives? Could they make decisions about marriage? Could they make decisions about having or not having children? Could they have, did they have the power to decide whether they want to get educated or not? No. So Assam has always been patriarchal, but my contention is that these pre-existing patriarchal structures have become more solidified, have become more rigid ever since our association with the Indian mainland. And again, this has a lot to do with the history of militarization, with the armed violence that we have seen, and the kind of impunity with which the people in power operate here.
Right, ma'am. Ma'am, kindly share your insights in matters of gender selection and selective abortion in the rural world in practical terms, despite the legal banning on the same.
What do I say about that? It's not really my area of expertise, but it is something that is happening every day. And that is the kind of thing that happens despite legal, legal structures and systems being in place. So legality is, in its place, and then social and cultural structures are in their own place. And how the two interact is important, right? So who are the people who are responsible for making these legal structures stick, right? Who are the people who are going to impose these legal structures? If they are within this, very patriarchal system, and they are themselves patronizing this kind of behavior, legal structures are, legal systems are going to fail. So it's not about having a law, it's about how we use that law, how we execute that law, and so it's about the social structure, the larger, deeper systems at work, really.
Thank you, ma'am. We have another question. It sounds quite interesting. Do you have any alternatives for demasculinized government actions for national integration in the context of Northeastern social political instabilities? In the same context, what role would you define for women empowerment towards greater national integration?
Okay, that is an entire chapter that I have to write in my book, and I'm happy to share it with you when I've written it. But alternatives to, I'll try to address it as best as I can right now. Alternatives for demasculinized government actions and national integration. So I have a problem with the term national integration, really. I mean, if India is a union of states, if it is unity in diversity, we should, instead of trying to nationalize the different constituencies, and here I'm not just talking about the periphery, I'm not just talking about the Northeast, I'm talking about every single diverse constituent in the Union of India. Shouldn't we be celebrating the diversity instead of trying to, kind of uniformitize, right, nationalize? So I do not see national integration as a way of demasculinizing the system, because I think that is exactly what is masculinizing. It is not recognizing the distinctiveness. It is not, and that is a very anti-feminist idea, because in feminism, according to feminism, you respect each other's differences. You respect each other's immanent value. Every person, every individual, every community, every constituency has its own agency, its own, its own significance, and you accept them as they are. So trying to integrate, trying to make the Northeast something that it is not, it is a part of India, right? But you cannot make it India, right? So, and just say, just the nomenclature of Northeast, that is such a misnomer, because it's a diverse place, right? There are so many different communities there. And of course, for purposes of, we do simplify it. We do, break it down and call it the Northeast. But we have to understand that homogeneity is equivalent to masculinization and patriarchal control. We cannot control the differences. We have to have a dialogue across differences. And that is what we need in order for the Northeast to really feel a part of India, right? And to de-escalate the conflicts.
Thank you, ma'am. We have two more questions in the row, so I'll just read it out for you, ma'am. As we know, behind every successful man, there is a woman, unquote, the saying. Should there be the harmonious coexistence of all gender in bringing about a positive change, or each gender has to attain its independence for the same?
Okay, good for that. Okay, let me first address your question directly. Is gender attaining its independence? Of course, everybody has, like I said, the immanent value of every individual and every community, every gender that applies to that as well. So every person should have agency and harmonious coexistence, definitely. But I also think that it's often very problematic when we think in terms of dichotomies like man, woman, masculine, feminine. We need to move beyond this dichotomous view. We need to look at other possibilities, right? So why just man, woman? Why not the third gender, right? Why don't we look at, moving beyond these labels and just accepting, like I said, accepting differences and coexisting. So gender labels are also problematic in their own way. And like I said, going beyond dichotomies should be our aim, really. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, ma'am. You rightly pointed out. There's a last question, ma'am. With reference to your book, Where You Come From, Where You Go, which is based on folk fables, how do you see oral narratives shaping the culture and tradition of Northeast Indian identity?
Thank you for bringing that up and reading my book. Folk narratives. Really, I think we need to return to those because that is where the essence of where we come from lies, and that was the reason why I actually retold these folk tales in that book, right? Because we have to know where we came from in order to chart the path towards where we are going, right? We cannot do away. There was a question about traditions, and like I said, we cannot do away with traditions. They are there, but we need to question those, right? We need to critically examine those, accept what we what we should, in order to be able to move forward and emerge from conflict and live peacefully. So the question was about shaping the culture and tradition of Northeast Indian identity, right? So once again, I want to reiterate that the Northeast is a very heterogeneous area, right? So like all parts of India, like all parts of the world, no place in the world is, you don't have monolithic entities anywhere. Even as individuals, our identities are changing all the time, right? We are not one person from 1 year to the next or one moment to the next even. So we have to understand that it's all in flux. And that is what I wanted to bring out with this collection of folktales, that we had these narratives, right? We need to look at them differently now, and we need to use them to go forward and to find ways of coexistence. So when I was teaching at this, what I used to do was I would ask my students to bring stories from their communities and share them, right? So it's a way of looking at different narratives, being able to respect each other's worldviews and being able to understand where the other person is coming from. And I think that's not just the way for Northeast to go, but it is the way for, that's something that we need in India today. I mean, the kind of India that we are living in. And that's something that everybody needs, the entire world, I think.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was indeed an insightful and an interactive session, and you so patiently answered all the questions. And I'm thankful to all the participants for putting up such interesting questions. Well,
I'm really
yes, ma'am.
thankful, ma'am, for mentioning at the end of your talk, that it's very important for us to return back to our roots. And I have lived my entire life in India's Northeast, in Assam. And I really feel, and my work is also entirely based on India's Northeast literature. And I really feel that going back to our roots is so essential It's not that Assam is, or the entire Northeast is only about our political conflicts, and that the mainland India feels that we are only about terrorism and all the ghastly things which are happening, which I personally feel, having lived there my entire life, that those kind of stories are there everywhere. But what makes Assam and the Seven Sisters unique are our stories. So that's why I had mentioned about this book, Where You Come and From Where You Go, which is one of those beautiful books like Isterin Kaya's, the books from Nagaland that she writes about. So I could somehow connect your book to those books. And I feel that more and more people should read about our folk stories, should read about, the fables, the folklores which originate from India's Northeast. And I must congratulate you for writing this kind of a book, which really triggers the reader's mentality to understand what India's Northeast is all about. It was a wonderful session, and I really thoroughly enjoyed it. Over to you, Swati. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And I agree to what our director ma'am has said, and I'm very much in tune with what you have said, Dr. Uddipana ma'am, because I'm personally drawn to Northeast and especially Assam, since when I was brought up there. So I can connect to most of the ideas that you have shared, ma'am. Well, the essence of all beautiful art is gratitude, and I'm elated to propose a vote of thanks. To quote Helen Keller, the best and the most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt with the heart. I convey my heartfelt thanks to all those who have joined the conference today. And thank you so much, Dr. Uddipana ma'am, for taking out time from your busy schedule and sparing time with us. Thank you all for making this conference a success. Thank you all. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you, Swati. Thank you so much, Payal.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thanks, everybody, for being there. Bye.